What's up, horror fans? It's Danny from the Lassercast, and I'm recording this on October 1st, the beginning of the most magical month of the year for us horror fans. And I got a really special treat this afternoon. My local theater was playing a double feature of the original 1932 The Mummy by Carl Freud and The Bride of Frankenstein by James Whale. Two Universal Monster movies back to back. I got together with Chris, formerly of this channel, and now Future Boy Reviews, and our buddy James, and we're three of the biggest horror fans that we know, and we got together and we saw these two Universal classics back to back. About 11 months ago, I did a video on this channel where I went to see The Wolfman and the Invisible Man in a very similar double feature presented by Fathom Events. And it was super cool getting to see these movies. It's a double dose of Boris Karloff. I'm actually wearing my Bride of Frankenstein t-shirt that I got at Universal. Karloff is fantastic as Ardith Bey in The Mummy and Imhotep. Great performances in that movie. It's not my favorite of the Universal Monster movies. My favorite is probably The Bride of Frankenstein, so it was really cool to get to see Bride of Frankenstein on the big screen for the first time. And it's actually a great parallel to what I came here to talk to you about today, which is episode 1 of Shudder's Queer for Fear, The History of Queer Horror. This is going to be a 4-part series that delves into, as the title suggests, the history of queer horror, which probably goes back much further than you think. In fact, we always see this whenever a horror movie comes out that has a political point to make, or not even a political point, just a point to make. There's always a group of horror fans that scream about, oh, I hate these new woke horror movies. And if it's one thing you can learn from a channel like Shudder, which has produced an incredible documentary and has had it on their service for years now, called Horror Noir, about the history of black horror films and horror creators, black horror creators, to now be doing this 4-part series on queer horror, you learn that horror as a genre has always had a message behind it. And because of who the creators are, that message has very often been messages being told from groups that have been held back in society, whether it is women, whether it is blacks, whether it is queer people. And this series, and this is where the history teacher in me was like into this series right away, we get some true history here. We are going back to the birth of the genre. We're talking about Mary Shelley, Oscar Wilde, Bram Stoker. We're talking about the 1800s and the turn of the century here. With some of the earliest creators. There is no horror genre without Mary Shelley. And then my favorite part of this, and again, this is where the horror fan and the history teacher meet up, is that they actually use they use primary source documents to reinforce their points. You know, there are gonna be those vocal haters out there, with lack of a better word, trolls, you could use that word too, like, oh, horror's not, this isn't about, Frankenstein isn't about being queer, and Dracula isn't about being queer. Well, why don't we listen to an actual letter written by Mary Shelley about how she wants to play, what's the term here, tousy-mousy with a woman named Jane. That's an actual primary source document that is right here. They have letters written by Bram Stoker in the late 1800s to openly gay American poet Walt Whitman that come across pretty obviously as love letters. And it's just, you see, there's this big, they pretty much come out right away, right at the beginning of this episode, and talk about how horror, being queer and horror are very similar. They are both for the people who live on the outsides of society, and they focus on what many people, especially historically, view as, transgression, or the people who either are queer or the people who like horror are seen as transgressive. I've seen this in my own life as a horror fan, where sometimes you will explain to somebody what you love about horror and they will just give you this weird, quizzical, dirty look like, what is wrong with you? Like, how can you watch these movies where people get sliced up and there's so much blood? Aren't you disgusted? Like, what is wrong with you? And that is very often how queer people feel that they are treated by society. I know I'm talking about this show as a straight white man, and I can't obviously be the voice of queer people who and give my perspective from that point of view. But what I can do is review a show like this, where so many of the voices, so many of the talking heads, the people who are speaking to us are members of the queer community. They're actors, just to name a few. Cassandra Peterson, Elvira is here. They're filmmakers. Karen Kusama is shown here. Brian Fuller, who directed this episode and is so important to this series, he is shown, and he created the show Hannibal for TV, which had very obvious queer undertones, and it was just a wonderful episode. 47 minutes, and basically, just to give you a breakdown, this episode covered Mary Shelley and her sexuality and how that influenced her writings of, obviously, Frankenstein. And they actually show the clips from Bride of Frankenstein from the very beginning of Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley getting together to start to talk about their ghost stories. And to recommend another film that they actually show clips from, if you haven't seen the film Gothic, which starred Julian Sands and Gabriel Byrne, and I think it was Natasha Richardson as Mary Shelley. And fantastic movie. It came out in, I believe, the late 80s. But you get that whole queer vibe about, like, basically they were just these young people who were doing drugs, having sex, and writing the craziest shit they could come up with. And for Mary Shelley, it was Frankenstein. And they make this great point about how Frankenstein, it's a woman inventing the sci-fi horror genre, and the scariest story that she can come up with is a story about what would happen if a man created life, and without a woman's help. And of course, it goes terribly wrong. I thought that was a really interesting part there. And that letter that I referenced, where she writes about how she wants to get tousy mousy with a woman named Jane, is read by just this amazing Alaska thunderfuck. Just fantastic. That was a great part of it. And then it goes into even more history. We get into Oscar Wilde, who wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and about how he basically lost his career and his life because he was arrested and charged with buggery, which was a old British term for male-on-male sex. And that in Oscar Wilde's, and they even make reference to Dorian Gray, The Picture of Dorian Gray being a story about somebody who hides the real them in the painting, and so they stay one way. It's basically it's a story of repression. They refer to it as the historians that are being interviewed, and they make a connection to Dorian Gray influencing characters like Mr. Ripley and Patrick Bateman in horror years later. And then they get into, and they spend almost half the episode on basically the birth of the vampire from Bram Stoker, who was, according to his letters that we read, primary source documents, a closeted homosexual who, after Oscar Wilde was arrested and found guilty, basically became very publicly homophobic, to the point where he married Oscar Wilde's ex-wife, and she would be the one to sue over the makings of Nosferatu, because they basically took Stoker's Dracula and basically took the whole story and made it into a movie. But Joe Bob tells a great story about that when they covered Nosferatu on the last drive-in. But then they get into continuing with the vampire and going from Bram Stoker into F.W. Murnau, the German filmmaker who created Nosferatu, and how not only was this a movie about where he's using it to, talk about sexuality, but it's also about Jewishness and how there's all of these hidden subtexts in that film. And then we go from that back into Todd Browning's Dracula and Bela Lugosi, and they bring up this line that Stoker writes in all of his works. This man belongs to me, that Dracula says in the original Lugosi film, and he actually chases off his female vampire brides to claim Harker for himself, and it's a very interesting line, and they just do such a great job of marrying the horror with the actual history to show that queerness has always had a place in the genre. And if you're a straight person, you should not go into this getting ready to we're gonna destroy your visions of the old horror, and we're going to wokeify, and we're gonna make everything gay and everything's gonna be woke now. No, that's bullshit garbage. It's giving you insight into how queerness has always been a part of the genre. And so many horror movies have that element to them. And you think about, vampire movies, you mentioned Patrick Bateman. Think about American Psycho. There's so much, like, gay subtext in a movie like that. There's so much subtext in so many of these films. And just because you talk about queerness or, how the role of a woman or the role of African Americans, it's not trying to force an opinion on you. It's just trying to show that this has always been here. That's what horror is great at. That's why horror is such an inclusive genre, because even if you could be the whitest, straightest, malest horror fan, your love of horror is going to make you feel like an outsider. And there are going to be people that look at you weird because you're a horror fan. And a lot of people who aren't white, straight men use that, and they cling to the horror genre even more. And this was a great first episode. I cannot wait to watch. I actually watched it twice. I watched it once early this morning, and then I watched it again to take some notes on it. I cannot wait for next. I believe they're coming out on Friday. These new episodes. There's 4 episodes in this series. They're running through the month of October. Pete and I have so much coming out. We are getting together in the morning, and we are going to be doing a book review of Christopher Pike's The Midnight Club to prep for Mike Flanagan's The Midnight Club coming to Netflix early next week. Chucky Season 2 starts next week. I'll be covering every episode of that. Pete and I are covering Shudder's 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments. We do those reviews every Wednesday evening to Thursday, and they go up usually either Wednesday night or Thursday afternoon. So you could follow along on that. And the theater is filled with great horror. There's Pearl, there's Barbarian, there's Smile. Halloween Ends is coming out in a week and a half. Trick or Treat and the original Halloween are coming back into theaters. So you are not going to be short on great horror to watch during this time of year. It is a absolutely wonderful time to be a horror movie fan. Also, if you like your author interviews, Pete just got done interviewing Megan Stockton, a great author in the horror genre, and that interview will be up at some point, probably this week. But yeah, we have so much stuff coming for you. It's the best time of year for horror fans. So get Shudder, watch Queer for Fear, the history of queer horror, watch the 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments, and we'll see you very soon.